What we were doing last time when we stopped was looking at David's reign, which the text devotes a great deal of time to. There is more focus on David than any other of the kings. And the reason for that is that we'll see on Wednesday when we start talking about the book of Kings, all of the kings in the south will ultimately be compared to David, either positively or negatively. So David plays a major role in how the writers think about monarchy. That will come as something of a surprise to you, given the fact that the material that we looked at last time about David's rise to power was all laudatory when it came to David. Granted, there were some suspicious things that he did. He had a private army, which Deuteronomy thinks he's not supposed to have. He has a questionable relationship to Saul as the anointed king of Israel. On some occasions, he seems to be supportive of Saul. When Saul needs him to fight Philistines, David is often somewhere else, frequently over with the Philistines, doing exactly what we do not know. But he's not there to be helpful when Saul needs him. So there are some ambiguities built into David's story, including what he finally does to the descendants of Saul. And for fear, apparently, that there would be an effort to revive the dynasty of Saul, David has killed, not personally, of course, he has someone else do it for him, but he kills off all of the descendants of the house of Saul. This will come back later on in the material we're looking at today. This will come back to haunt him, quite literally, because there will be several insurrections in the northern kingdom from the descendants of Saul who have not forgiven David for what he did to the descendants of the house of Saul. He may have solved an immediate problem, but he's created a long-term problem for himself, which he seems unable to deal with. Nevertheless, the narrative reaches its climax with the notion that David's kingdom is now firmly established. And as a sign of the firm establishment of the kingdom, we have in chapter 8 of 2 Samuel a description of the various officers that David installed. This is a really interesting list. If you go trying to track what David is doing in appointing these things, he's making a couple of different moves. One of them is to appoint people from both the north and the south, which looks very much like an effort at getting both sides in this fight together. And so both of them are represented in his official bureaucracy. But David also, in the southern contingent of his administration, has a lot of people who seem to be related to him in one way or another. They are part of the Davidic family and very definitely leaders in the southern tribe of Judah. So David is making sure that he has friendly voices around him when he is governing. That would slip by you were it not for the fact that it's going to arise later on in the narrative as a major problem when various people begin to turn against David. The highlight of the story, however, is chapter 7, which is the wish by David, the narrative of David's wish to build a temple for the ark and for Yahweh, who has been wandering around with the people since the Exodus in a kind of portable throne or shrine, the Ark of the Covenant. And at the moment, David has removed the ark from its keeping place to Jerusalem and thereby made Jerusalem not only his personal city, but also the city for the deity. So state and temple come together at this point. And David wants to make that a permanent arrangement, and he proposes to do it by building a temple for the deity. He wants a fixed space and not a movable space. What is interesting about the narrative in chapter 7 of 2 Samuel is that the deity refuses that offer and says, "This is not traditional. I have not been in a permanent dwelling place since I took up with you back at Sinai, and I don't really want one. If I had wanted one, I would have told you about it long before this." So the deity refuses David's offer of a fixed place of worship. On the other hand, God does promise that it's a kind of twofold promise. The most important part of it for David is that David is promised a dynasty, that after David's death, one of his sons will reign. And in this way, the dynasty of David will become a house. It will become eternal. So there's a play on the word house, meaning temple, and the word house, meaning dynasty. And David has, according to the narrative, already built himself a house in the form of a palace. So you've got a triple wordplay going on there, all surrounding the single word house. That seems to be important for the writer. So David is promised an eternal dynasty, and in the process, God promises to remain in Jerusalem, even though there is no fixed dwelling there yet. And God says that the son of David, who will turn out to be Solomon, will in fact build a house for the divine name. Notice that we are using Deuteronomic terminology in this chapter, and that is something of a puzzle, because we know how the Deuteronomist feels about permanent dwellings for the deity. That's not a part of Deuteronomic tradition. And we also know how the Deuteronomist feels about monarchy, and to put it mildly, the Deuteronomist is conflicted about monarchy. Yes, there can be kings, but they have to fit certain patterns. And David does not seem to be in the process of using that particular pattern to model his own kingship. Nevertheless, the story reaches its height in chapter 7, and then we have the successful description of David's kingdom and how it is put together. Beginning with chapter 9 of 2 Samuel and stretching all the way into 1 Kings, the end of chapter 2, though, things change radically. And we get a very different kind of literature in this section. It is not the cliche-loaded narrative that we have come to expect from the Deuteronomists, this thoroughly predictable Deuteronomic prose that seems to be so common in this part of the narrative. This is something quite different. And you notice it immediately when you cross the boundary from chapter 8 to chapter 9. This simply reads differently, even in English translation, from what you have before. So moving from chapter 8 to chapter 9, we begin what is sometimes called by scholars the succession to the throne of David. That is the issue of whether or not the kingship will indeed descend to David's descendants, or putting it in theological terms, whether the promise that was made to David in chapter 7 is actually going to be fulfilled. There is a major shift, as I said, in the literary style. The obvious cliches of Deuteronomy and the open theological commentaries that Deuteronomy was so fond of giving you in the previous material disappear. The pace of the narrative slows visibly. There are now extended passages of dialogue. This reminds some people of the Yahwist in terms of literary style. It's probably not the Yahwist, but it's someone else who has a very good control of the Hebrew of the period and who is a wonderful storyteller. The way these stories are told is simply remarkable. But the introduction of dialogue to the narrative helps to develop characters in the narrative. And they are not idealized characters. I mean, what do we know really about Saul? Just to use a comparison. Saul gets very little actual attention as a human being in the narrative. But here we're going to have a buildup of a number of different characters, all of whom emerge as individuals with normal human strengths and weaknesses, loves and hates, passions, emotions, feelings. The writer is a brilliant prose stylist, and the vocabulary is very different from the Deuteronomistic vocabulary. If you read this in Hebrew, you immediately start reaching for the dictionary much more often because you're running into words that you really don't know from anywhere else. It's also marked by a good bit of understatement. And this, again, is a characteristic of the Yahwist. What is not narrated is often as important as what is narrated. Ambiguity becomes obvious in the narrative. There are different ways of reading the narrative, and the narrative itself seems to play on that. And this is not true of the Deuteronomists. Deuteronomic prose is always clear and repetitive. If you don't get it the first time, it's going to come around 2 or 3 more times until you do get it. Not so with this material. This is very subtle writing, and the reader is expected to work at this and to supply a lot of the meaning. The writer seems to be not only a brilliant prose stylist, but also to have a detailed knowledge of what went on in the royal court in David's time. Whether this adds up to being historically accurate or not is another matter. But it is someone who seems to know how the court operated. And for that reason, scholars have often thought that because of the remarkable portraits of individuals that appear in this literature, that this is the beginning of genuine historical writing. That's probably a stretch. It's certainly not historical writing as the Germans of the 19th century would have thought of it, portraying history as it actually was. But it is a different kind of writing from what we get in the Deuteronomic history itself. You should not be misled by the appearance of objectivity, as many textbook writers are. This is certainly not history in the modern sense, but it is a story told from a particular political and religious point of view. And that point of view slowly begins to emerge as the writing proceeds. It's a tribute to the skill of the author that we are only rarely aware of this tendency toward giving us a shaped history. The writer is very good at doing that, so that if we're not careful, we will be lured into thinking that this is actually the way David's court operated. The narrative focus is on David throughout the entire section. He is the main concern of the author, and other characters are considered only in their relationship to David. Furthermore, although the narrative seems at first glance to be humanistic, this too is misleading. God rarely appears to intervene in the story. unlike some of the stories in the Deuteronomistic history, where God is a constant participant in the stories. Not so in the throne succession. God actually intervenes only rarely, and there are very few theological comments that are made along the way. Yet the narrative itself is profoundly theological in two different ways. The first is, in the present form of the book, the narrative immediately follows the dynastic oracle in 2 Samuel 7, that is, the promise to David of an eternal dynasty, and the promise of God's eternal dwelling in Jerusalem. The narrative material laid out in the throne succession therefore presents the first test of this promise of an eternal Davidic line. Will the throne in fact pass to one of David's heirs, as Yahweh has promised? Or will the internal weaknesses in David and the similar weaknesses in his children cause Yahweh to withdraw the promise just as it was withdrawn from Saul? That's the theological problem of the narrative. The literary shaping of the narrative keeps the reader in suspense until the very end, and the very end is not really the end of the David story. The way it is shaped, the very end is the very end of the book of Kings, in which Israel, Judah, goes off into exile in Babylon, and the question first raised in this narrative of David's successors will be the question left open at the end of Kings, and that is whether or not we are talking now about the end of Israel and its special relationship to the deity. So there is a profound theological line that is running through all of this material, and it begins here with a series of ups and downs, false starts and moves forward that the writer seems to be using to keep us interested in what is going on. Overall, there is a sub-theme in this promise and its fulfillment that is the main theme, and that is the theme of whether or not the king finally is above the law. Or is the king subservient in some way or another to the deity? And if so, in what way? Is the promise in 2 Samuel 7 to be interpreted as a carte blanche for the king, allowing the king to do anything that the king wants? That's one of the sub-themes that will be explored almost immediately, and it's one that will play a role in the remainder of the David story. The second theological line that is running through here is that there is a kind of theological typology going on in the narrative. David's children share his own faults, but in spite of this, and even though they suffer, they nevertheless will retain the promise, just to sort of give away the ending of the story. But David is also in this a symbol of all Israel, as has been made clear in 2 Samuel 7, verse 24. David in some way, and what happens to David and the monarchy, stands in for Israel and Israel's fate. So it is not unusual or not unreasonable to think that in exile, when this story finally reaches its conclusion with the exile of the king to Babylon in the end of the book of Kings, there is reason to see in these narratives a clue to the history of Israel as a whole. Israel in exile identified closely, apparently, with the character of David. And that's why the material becomes so important for later generations. Like David, Israel in exile recognized that it had sinned, and like David, Israel had suffered because of that sin. But like David, they could also look forward to the fulfillment of Yahweh's promise. Would the promise survive the exile? That's the new question. Eternal election as the people of God is the promise now, rather than the promise of an eternal Davidic line. And it will become a symbol for the fate of the Judean monarchy as a whole, and finally, the nation as a whole. So there is some pretty heavy-duty theological work that is going on underneath these currents of the David story, which are going to be important for later generations. In the meantime, these major issues are all being treated in what is simply a delicious set of narratives. And you ought to just read these and indulge in them. They are wonderful narratives. Even though they are not always favorable to David, they give you a sense of the character of David, for good or for ill. And they're just delightful to read. The story really opens in chapter 9 with the Mephibosheth incident. So David asked, now that he has established his kingdom and gotten this divine promise, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Out of the clear blue with an established kingdom, why is David asking a question like this? If I were a remnant of the house of Saul, I would be nervous if David were asking this kind of a question. What kind of fidelity is David interested in showing? Now, in fact, we are told by the narrator something we did not already know. There was still left a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba. And he was summoned to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." And the king said, "Is there anyone remaining of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan." This is information we didn't know either. We thought all of the Saulites had been killed off earlier in David's purge. David thought that too. And this is not good news to David. You can see, however, why Ziba might have been overlooked by the other narrator, the earlier narrator. There remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet, which is another way of saying something that is going to be repeated often in this narrative. This would disqualify him from being a threat to David. He's not somebody who is equipped to lead an army against David. He could even ritually be disqualified because of physical deformity from being king, although that's not clearly established in biblical law. In any case, this is a surprise that bothers David. So the first action of the king is to say with some feeling in his voice, "Where is he?" Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar." And so King David sent and brought him to the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David. Notice the genealogy that is given each time, that we're really dealing with a descendant of Saul who theoretically, if there were a principle of inheritance of the kingship, would make him a candidate to be king. And Mephibosheth answered, I am your servant. David said, do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always. And he did obeisance and said, what is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I am? This sounds like a good deal, but the notion of eating at the king's table has a double-edged comment behind it. That means that he has to be there every day, and the king has to know where he is. If he's late for dinner one day, the king is going to want to know why and where he is and what he is doing. So you can look at this as a form of house arrest. That's the other way of interpreting what David is up to. But at this point in the story, he is, in spite of the fact that Mephibosheth, because of his physical deformity, does not seem to be a threat to David. David nevertheless wants him in eyesight for the entire time. And so we begin the story with this ambiguous notion of just how firm David's throne really might be. And here it appears that David is still haunted by the ghost of Saul and his descendants. So maybe the kingdom is not as firm as David makes it out to be, and later on in the story, Mephibosheth will in fact be part of the opposition to David as during the Absalom revolt, which is a piece of the story still to come. This is followed in chapter 10 by the story of the Aramean Wars, in which it becomes clear this is another lovely story in which David is trying his hand at foreign policy and not succeeding. His efforts at making peace with the neighbors all go awry. They misinterpret everything that he is doing, and therefore he has to take some steps to do this. Notice in the way the story is told, the concern that David has for his own ambassadors that he sends to try to make peace with the neighbors. And he does seem to have this personal interest in people that emerges in stories like this, that begin to give you some sense of why, after all, in spite of David's many faults, people in his own regime will support him in the revolt of Absalom. This is followed immediately by one of the most famous stories in the collection, which is the story of Uriah the Hittite and the adultery. The story here is told quite laconically, not a word more than is necessary. This will remind you again of the Yahwist. Not a word more than is necessary to get the basic facts of the story out. So it was in the spring of the year. What's the significance of the spring of the year? That is the time when kings go forth to fight. And so in the spring of the year, when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab. Right away, a small judgment on David's effectiveness as king. If David had been where he was supposed to be, none of this would have happened. If David had not left the fighting to someone else, as he did, incidentally, in chapter 10, where it was also Joab who did the bulk of the fighting for David, and then David came and sort of took the glory from the victory. So David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. Everybody seems to be out of Jerusalem except David and this woman. And it happened one afternoon when David rose from his couch. In the middle of the afternoon when David rose from his couch. Notice the subtlety of this author. And was walking around on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to inquire about the woman, and it was reported, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" This is all the information that is conveyed about her, but we already know enough about her to know how the story is going to go. She is very beautiful. She is from a good family in Jerusalem, and she is married. So the plot is set. We know one other thing. He sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. Why is that detail there? Because very shortly she is going to be pregnant, and there's going to be no doubt of who the husband or the person responsible, the male in this liaison is. It cannot be the husband. The husband is off fighting with Joab and the army. Notice how quickly the story is told. He slept with her. She returned to her house. The woman conceived. She sent and told David, "I am pregnant." Notice how quickly that narrative moved. Notice also there is no lack or no insertion of a kind of theological judgment at this point. Just the facts of the story. So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." Now Uriah the Hittite is an interesting character. He is referred to in the narrative repeatedly as Uriah the Hittite. He's a Hittite. He's not an Israelite. It means that he is part of David's mercenary forces. So he is one of the hired hands that David has brought on to keep him in power. So he is a Hittite. But he has a Yahweh name. He has changed his name from whatever the Hittite name was to Uriah. Yahweh is my light. And so he has become a Yahwist, and he has married into a prominent Jerusalem family. He will also, momentarily, as the narrative progresses, be more faithful to Yahweh and to this business of fighting a holy war than David will be, raising all sorts of interesting questions about where justice and right lie in this story. So when Uriah came to him, now suddenly this narrative slows down, and we get this long and somewhat puzzling and finally painful conversation between Uriah and David. Just at the point where we want the narrative to march on, it's not going to march on. You can imagine the reaction of Uriah when the king sends for him to come back to Jerusalem. Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah came to him, David says, "Well, how's Joab getting along? How are the people doing in the battle?" And you can just see the puzzlement in Uriah's mind. Why is the king hauling him back to ask this kind of a question? I mean, he knows what's going on in the battle. He's being informed of what goes on in the battle. And then David gets to the point and says to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." That is a euphemism with a slight nudge in the ribs. He wants him to sleep with his wife. He wants plausible deniability for this child that is about to be born. Uriah will not have any of it. Uriah went out to the king's house and there followed after him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all of the servants of the Lord, and did not go down to his house. And when it was told to David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "Look, you've just come from a long journey. Why did you not go down to your house? Are you thick-headed?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping on the open field. Shall I go down to my house to eat and drink and sleep with my wife?" He knows exactly what David is wanting him to do, and he is not having any of it because he sees it as a violation of the law governing the holy war. This, of course, has escaped David. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence, and made him drunk. Maybe that will help. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his Lord, but he did not go down to his house. Notice the way the narrator is using the repetition of the phrase. And so in the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He trusts Uriah, the faithful mercenary, not to try to figure out what is in that letter. He gives it to him knowing that it will simply be given to Joab. And in the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him so that he may be struck down and die." He's absolutely clear about what he wants done. He wants somebody else to do it. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew there were valiant warriors. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. And when Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting, he instructed the messenger, "When you have finished telling the king all the news about the fighting, then if the king's anger rises and he says to you, 'Why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who was it, after all, who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died? Why did you go so near the wall?' And then you shall say, 'Your servant Uriah is dead too.'" Joab has made an elementary military mistake here. He has allowed the heat of the battle to push him too close to the wall of the city that they are besieging. And when you do that, you are liable to have things thrown at you or to be shot at from the wall. And so you have to keep a bow shot's distance between you and the city wall if you want to continue to besiege it. Joab knows he's made a mistake, and he covers it up because he knows that David, the one who is not going out to battle with the troops, nevertheless knows how to fight a war and is going to be upset at the way that Joab is doing that. He knows quite literally how David is going to react to the news of this reversal in the siege. And he knows how to handle David. He knows what to say when David does this. So it's both an insight into David's character and also an insight into Joab, who is faithful to David and his main military support and knows exactly how to handle David. So the messenger went and told David all that Joab had sent him. And the messenger said to David, "The men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. And then the archers shot at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Thus you shall say to Joab, says David, don't let it worry you. David now is greatly relieved, as Joab knew he would be. He's greatly relieved. Don't let the matter trouble you. For the sword now goes this way and goes that way. Press your attack on the city and overthrow it. And he encouraged him. And when the wife of Uriah heard that her husband was dead, she made lamentation for him. When the mourning period was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. And at the very end of the narrative, we get the only theological comment. The thing that David had done displeased Yahweh. David has done two things. He has committed adultery with one of his subjects, and he has killed Uriah. Both of them are things that the king does not have a license to do. There are limits to royal power. So the thing that David had done displeased Yahweh. And Yahweh sent Nathan the prophet to David. Nathan is one of the court prophets. He's one of the people who had given the oracle in 2 Samuel 7, appropriately, about an eternal line for David. And he comes with this absolutely, clearly cockamamie story, which everybody ought to see through. We certainly do. We know exactly what the story is about. And the way in which it is told is simply ridiculous. And David falls for it hook, line, and sinker, which may tell you something about the way that David runs his own business as king. He is subject to being convinced by these kinds of stories. And so Nathan says, out of the clear blue, there were two men in a certain city, one rich and the other poor. And the rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing at all but one little ewe lamb which he had bought. And he brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It was a member of the family. And he used to eat out of its meager fare and drink out of his cup and to sleep at night with the family. And it was like a daughter to him. Now, you would think, given the style of this presentation, that David would catch on to this, but David doesn't. He buys it completely. Now, there was a traveler who came to the rich man, and he didn't want to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the traveler who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the guest who had come to him. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As Yahweh lives, the man who had done this is a dead duck," is what he says. He's as good as dead. He deserves a death penalty. This is really given even the heart-rending way in which the story is told, that a death penalty for this really exceeds any kind of Israelite law. The king is going overboard on this. And if this is the sign of how David ran his judicial system, you can see why later on, when Absalom complains about it, there may be just grounds for Absalom doing this. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And then Nathan, of course, springs the trap. You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Now we finally get the judgment oracle. I anointed you king over Israel. I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom. I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And David said to Nathan, I have sinned. There's an immediate reaction on the part of David. He knows he has been caught, and he immediately recognizes that he deserves this and that he has sinned. And Nathan's response from the deity is equally fast. Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned Yahweh, the child that is born to you shall die. And Nathan then went to his house. And sure enough, soon there is this heart-wrenching story of the death of the child that is born to Bathsheba and to David. The first one that the two of them have. To David's credit, he does take Bathsheba into his household, and she becomes one of his numerous wives. And in the harem intrigue, which eventually follows, it will be her son, Solomon, who is the successor to David. Things are going downhill now for the Davidic dynasty. What David does in his own family now is going to be repeated in the other generations that are part of the story. The rape of Tamar by Amnon, a son of David, and a daughter of Absalom, who is another son of David. The dynasty is not at peace with itself. This sexual boundary violation is going to continue through the next generation. And indeed, the sword will not depart from David's house. Even at the end of the Absalom revolt, where David is almost successfully driven out of the city by Absalom, who is trying to get revenge over the mistreatment of his sister by Amnon, as another son of David. There is revolt within the family. There is murder within the family. There is boundary transgression within the family. And David almost loses his throne, but it will be the professional army and a few faithful courtiers who keep him in power and tell him how to do that. And he does it at the cost of his own son, Absalom. That's the only way in which the revolt can be put down. And as always, it is Joab who knows how to do this and what has to be done. And we have this series of conversations between David and Joab about how this gets cleaned up. And it costs David dearly. So David does not get out of this clean. And it will be the story or the struggle over the throne, which continues at the beginning of Kings. We'll talk about that next time. The rise of Solomon, and Solomon is cut in the same image as his father. And we'll see that going on throughout the rest of the Judahite line. All right, we'll stop with that, and next time we'll talk about the Book of Kings and what difference it made to the exilic community.